Slide 1. Title slide. Oil Embargo 1973-74. Energy as a geopolitical weapon. Slide content. Global energy crisis. OPEC versus industrial economies. Oil as strategic leverage. Turning point in global power. The oil embargo of 1973 and 1974 represents one of the most significant turning points in modern economic and geopolitical history. It demonstrates that control over energy resources can generate immense strategic leverage over global powers. During this crisis, oil-producing nations used supply restrictions as a political tool, revealing the structural vulnerability of industrial economies dependent on imported petroleum. The event reshaped the balance of power between resource exporters and resource importers, as well as it forced countries to reconsider their energy policies, foreign relations, and economic resilience strategies. Slide 2. Historical context. Background. Global dependence on oil. Slide content. Rapid industrialization increased oil demand, oil power, transportation, and industry. Western economies dependent on imports. OPEC gained influence in pricing. By the late 1970s, oil had become the primary energy source powering industrial economies. Transportation systems, aviation, manufacturing industries, agriculture, and even military logistics relied heavily on petroleum. Western economies, especially the United States and European countries, consumed vast quantities of oil but were increasingly dependent on imports from the Middle East. Oil producing countries gradually realized their growing strategic importance. As demand increased, these countries gained influence over global pricing structures. This dependency created a structural vulnerability in advanced economics that would later be exploited during the embargo. Slide 3. Immediate cause. Trigger. The 1973 Arab-Israeli War. Slide content. War began October 1973. Arab states opposed Western support for Israel. Oil used as political pressure tool. Supply restrictions import on key countries. The immediate cause of the oil embargo was the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. Arab members of OPEC imposed restrictions on oil exports to the United States and other countries perceived to be supporting Israeli military. Oil became a geopolitical weapon. Instead of direct military confrontation with global superpowers, oil-producing nations applied economic pressure by restricting energy supply. The embargo targeted major industrial economies including the United States, Netherlands, Portugal, and others. This demonstrated that economic tools could influence geopolitical decision-making. Slide 4. Role of OPEC. OPEC strategic influence. Slide content. Organization of petroleum exporting countries controlled major share of global oil supply, coordinated production cuts, strengthened collective bargaining power. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries played a central role in the crisis. OPEC coordinated production cuts and export restrictions among member states. This collective action increased their bargaining power significantly. Instead of negotiating individually with oil companies, producing nations acted together, strengthening their influence over energy markets. The prices and reshaped revenue distribution in favor of producing states. The crisis revealed strategic importance of cartel behavior in commodity markets. Slide 5. Oil price shock, price explosion and economic shock. Slide content. Oil prices doubled and quadrupled. Energy costs increased globally. Transportation and production costs rose. Inflation accelerated rapidly. One of the most dramatic consequences of the embargo was the rapid increase in oil prices. Within months, the price per barrel doubled, eventually quadrupled. Since oil is a fundamental input in transportation, manufacturing, electricity generation, and agriculture, the price shock affected almost every sector of the economy. Higher production costs translated into higher consumer prices. This triggered inflation across multiple industries. Governments struggled to control rising costs, and uncertainty increased across financial markets. Slide 6. Economic consequences, stagflation and global recession risk. Combination of inflation and slow growth, rising unemployment, reduced industrial output, economic instability worldwide. The oil shock contributed to a rare economic condition known as stagflation, where inflation rises when economic growth slows. Typically, inflation occurs during economic expansion, but the oil crisis created cost increases that reduced economic productivity. Businesses faced higher input costs, consumers reduced spending, and unemployment increased. Governments faced difficulty managing economic policy because traditional tools were ineffective against simultaneous inflation and stagnation. Slide 7. Political impact. Shift in global power balance. Slide content. Oil producers gained leverage, Western countries faced vulnerability. Energy became geopolitical weapon, resource control increased strategic power. The oil embargo shifted the balance of power between the industrial economies and resource producing countries. Oil producing nations gained significant influence over global economic conditions. The crisis demonstrated that economic leverage can influence foreign policy decision making. Countries dependent on imported energy had to reconsider diplomatic relationships with oil producing states. Energy security became a strategic priority in international relations. US response, policy reactions, and energy security. Strategic petroleum reserve created, fuel efficiency standards introduced, reduced speed limits implemented, domestic production encouraged. The United States implemented multiple policy changes in response to the crisis. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was created to store emergency oil supplies. Fuel efficiency standards were introduced to reduce energy consumption. Speed limits were lowered to conserve fuel. The government encouraged domestic oil production to reduce dependence on foreign suppliers. These measures aim to increase resilience against future supply disruptions. Global institutional response, creation of international agency coordination. International Energy Agency formed, cooperation among oil importing countries, shared energy information systems, emergency supply coordination. The crisis encouraged cooperation among industrial economies. The International Energy Agency was created to coordinate energy policy among oil importing nations. Countries shared information about supply levels and consumption patterns. Energy planning mechanisms were developed to manage future disruptions. These institutional changes improved coordination and reduced vulnerability to supply shocks. Long-term structural effects, energy diversification and innovation. Investment in nuclear energy increased, renewable energy research expanded, energy efficiency energy efficiency technologies improved, alternative fuels explode. The oil crisis encouraged investment in alternative energy sources. Nuclear power programs expanded in several countries. Research into renewable energy technologies increased. Governments invested in improving energy efficiency across boundaries. Although the transition away from oil was gradual, the crisis accelerated technological innovation in the energy sector. Slide 11. Financial system impact, petrodollars and global finance. Slide content. Oil exporters accumulate large revenues, capital recycled into global banks, increased international lending, financial globalization accelerated. Oil producing countries accumulated large financial surpluses due to higher prices. These revenue were deposited in international banks, creating a phenomenon known as petrodollar recycling. Banks use these funds to provide loans to developing countries. This increased the interconnectedness of global financial markets and contributed to expansion in international credit flows. Slide 12. Strategic lessons resource, dependency and power. Control of resources creates leverage, supply chains influence geopolitical strategy, economic vulnerability shapes foreign policy, energy security remains critical today. The oil embargo demonstrated that control over essential resources can generate significant political leverage. Supply chain dependencies influence strategic decision making. Countries reliant on external resources must consider vulnerability. Countries reliant on external resources must consider vulnerability when developing foreign policy. Energy security continues to be a central issue in international relations. Modern relevance: why the 1973 oil crisis still matters. Slide content: energy politics still influences global supply relations. Supply chain disruptions remain a risk. Commodity markets affect economic stability. Lessons applicable to modern geopolitics. The strategic lesson of the 1973 oil embargo remain relevant even today. Global economies continue to depend on critical resources such as energy, rare earth minerals, and semiconductor supply chains. Disruptions in supply chains can create economic instability. Understanding the dynamics of resource leverage helps understanding contemporary geopolitical tensions. Slide 14. Conclusion: energy power and global stability. Slide content: oil embargo reshaped global politics. Economic interdependence creates vulnerability. Resource control influences global hierarchy. Energy security remains strategic priority. The 1973-74 oil embargo revealed the structural dependence on industrial societies for energy resources. It demonstrated that economic leverage can be as powerful as military strength. The crisis reshaped global power relationships and encouraged long-term policy adjustments. The event remains one of the most important examples of how resource control can influence international systems.